the emergence of a zombie apocalypse. The world as we knew it was never going to be the same. What began as a strange illness, a virus spreading silently through the population, quickly escalated into something far worse. People didn't see it coming. The news stations reported the usual: diseases popping up in distant countries, health advisories, warnings about the flu, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That was until it was too late. At first, it was a few isolated cases. People were becoming violently ill, exhibiting strange behaviors, disorientation, fever, and aggression. But when they attacked others, things began to take a drastic turn. The infected would bite, scratch, and tear at their victims, who would then begin to show symptoms themselves. The cycle was swift and unforgiving. It didn't take long for authorities to realize that they were facing something more than just a flu outbreak. The virus was spreading too quickly, and there was no known cure. Panic set in. The initial breakdown. As hospitals filled with the sick, they were overwhelmed. There were no resources left to treat the increasing number of patients. Soon, the infected were being left unattended, their transformation into zombie-like creatures accelerating in the chaotic environment. Panic spread across the globe as cities descended into anarchy. Governments declared martial law, trying to contain the situation, but their efforts were in vain. Within days, most major cities fell. The streets were filled with chaos. People who once went about their daily routines now fought for survival. The ones who had not been infected or turned into mindless, ravenous creatures were left to fend for themselves. It wasn't just the threat of zombies that people had to fear. In these early days, survival also depended on the ability to trust, to work together, and to defend oneself from the dangers of other survivors. Those who managed to escape the initial wave of violence sought refuge wherever they could: abandoned homes, office buildings, remote countryside areas, any place that seemed like a safe haven from the hordes of zombies that roamed the streets. But as the infection spread and the numbers of the undead grew, even these supposed safe havens became too dangerous. The spread and transformation of society. Soon, society as it once was gone. Technology failed. Communication networks went down. The government structures that once held the world together dissolved in the wake of the apocalypse. Without law enforcement and military presence, the remaining survivors had to form their own groups. It was no longer about thriving, it was about surviving each day. In the cities, the streets were barren. Skyscrapers and office complexes, once symbols of human achievement, now stood as grim monuments to the fall of civilization. Vehicles littered the roads, abandoned in a rush to escape the growing threat. Shops and restaurants lay empty, their windows broken, looted for whatever supplies could be scavenged. People who once lived in a world of abundance and convenience were now scavenging for food, water, and anything that could be used for protection. In the midst of this chaos, survivors formed tight-knit communities. These groups were essential for survival, and they functioned like primitive tribes with their own rules and hierarchies. Trust was rare as betrayal became common. The infected were no longer the only danger. The desperation of humans in extreme circumstances brought out the darker side of human nature. Some survivors found themselves questioning their humanity as they fought to stay alive. The moral dilemma of whether to help a fellow human being or abandon them for personal survival weighed heavily on many. Was it right to sacrifice one person for the greater good of a group? Would it be better to trust no one, knowing that each person could be a potential threat, whether infected or not? These were the kinds of questions that arose when the world had no rules. The zombies, a new kind of enemy. Meanwhile, the zombies continued to evolve. The virus, having infected millions, had created a new kind of monster. They were no longer just mindless flesh-eating creatures, they had become a force of nature, an unstoppable wave of death and destruction. The infected moved in hordes, driven by an instinctive need to feed, but over time they adapted. Some zombies began to show signs of intelligence. The mindless creatures that once aimlessly wandered the streets now began to hunt with purpose. Some moved in packs, communicating with subtle gestures, learning from the environment around them. The world was quickly adapting to a new form of warfare. Humanity was no longer fighting for dominance, but for survival. The once secure cities were now overrun by the undead. Military barricades that had been set up to protect civilians fell as the zombies learned to breach their defenses. Survivors quickly realized that they had to stay mobile and alert. Standing still was a death sentence. The threat of infection became ever-present. People lived in fear not only of the zombies but of the possibility of becoming one themselves. The virus spread so quickly that even a small scratch could turn someone into a mindless killer. The once mundane act of getting a minor injury could now lead to a horrifying death. It wasn't just a physical battle, it was a mental one too. The constant stress and fear of becoming infected were just as dangerous as the zombies themselves. Fighting back. The resistance. As the infection spread and people began to adapt, resistance movements started to form. There were rumors of safe zones, areas where the infection had not reached, or at least had been contained. These safe zones were highly guarded and tightly controlled, and they offered hope to the survivors who had lived through months of chaos and destruction. However, they were rare, and getting to them was never easy. Those who made it to the safe zones were often forced to undergo rigorous screening and testing to ensure they were not infected. The fight for survival had become a battle not only against the undead, but also against the despair that had settled into the hearts of many survivors. There was a sense of isolation, with few people ever seeing another friendly face. Resources were scarce, and the idea of rebuilding society seemed almost impossible. Still, some held on to the belief that humanity could rise again and that the apocalypse could be survived despite all odds. A world forever changed. The world was unrecognizable now. The towering cities, once symbols of civilization, had become ruins. Nature was reclaiming the land that humanity had once dominated. Without the constant hum of cars, airplanes, and trains, the earth had returned to a more primal state. In many places, animals that had once been driven away by human expansion began to roam freely again. The landscapes were changing, but so were the people. Those who survived became different, hardened by the brutal environment they now inhabited. And so the world entered a new era, one where survival was the only thing that mattered. The idea of returning to the world that once existed seemed like a distant dream. The new reality was about navigating this altered world, where every decision, every interaction could be a matter of life or death. The emergence of the zombie apocalypse had transformed everything. It had shattered societies, broken down civilization, and forced humanity to face its own darkness. But even in the face of overwhelming despair, there remained a glimmer of hope. In the wreckage of the old world, survivors began to rebuild, determined to carry on, to fight for their futures, and to hold on to their humanity, no matter the cost. This narrative presents the gradual breakdown of society, focusing on the themes of survival, human nature, and the challenges faced in a post-apocalyptic world overrun by zombies. It explores the physical and psychological impacts of the outbreak, as well as the moral dilemmas that survivors must confront in their daily fight to stay alive. The tense moment, using the chest to hold a gun. In the midst of an apocalyptic world ravaged by the zombie outbreak, there are moments of desperation that test the limits of human endurance, both mentally and physically. One such moment arrived unexpectedly as the tension reached a boiling point and survival instincts kicked in. It wasn't just about fighting the undead, but about facing the terrifying reality of what it meant to live through the chaos and the price one had to pay to survive. It was in these moments that ordinary humans were forced to become extraordinary. As the world fell into an irreversible state of decay, the cities were flooded with the undead. The few survivors who had managed to escape into remote areas or barricade themselves inside fortified buildings now had one singular goal: stay alive. But the fight for survival wasn't just against the relentless waves of zombies. It was also a fight against time, against their dwindling resources, and against their own fears. With each passing hour, the pressure mounted. Hope was a distant memory, and despair was a constant companion. For those still standing, there was no room for weakness and no room for hesitation. The build-up to the moment, the group of survivors had been traveling for days. Their journey took them through decimated towns, abandoned streets, and the remnants of a civilization that had crumbled under the weight of its own fragility. They had become accustomed to the eerie silence of deserted places, the only sounds being the distant groans of the undead or the occasional scrape of a rusted vehicle. The world they knew had died, and all that was left was survival, survival at any cost. It had been a quiet few days, but everyone knew that peace in this world was fleeting. They were on edge, never knowing when the next attack would come. The group had been moving through an old shopping mall that had been transformed into a fortress of sorts, barricaded with every possible means of protection. But even the safest places weren't guaranteed to stay safe for long. The group had fortified the lower levels, but the upper floors were still vulnerable. The entire building creaked with the weight of time and the inevitable threat of collapse. They could feel the air grow heavy with anxiety. In the darkened hallways, a familiar silence blanketed everything. Yet it was the kind of silence that felt oppressive, the kind that made you feel like you were being watched. The survivors had grown accustomed to this sense of paranoia. It was no longer strange, it was expected. And yet nothing could prepare them for what would come next. The team had split up to search the upper levels for any supplies they could find. The more supplies they could gather, the longer they could hold out. It was a simple equation. Without food, water, and ammunition, survival was impossible. One of the survivors, Marcus, had volunteered to scout the eastern wing of the building. He was a strong, capable man, but the weight of the situation had begun to wear on him. Like the others, he had lost friends and family to the infection. He had become someone he didn't recognize, a warrior, a protector, a shell of the person he used to be. He knew he couldn't afford to be weak, not now. The encounter. Marcus had moved through the dark corridors, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He passed through abandoned stores, their shelves empty, and furniture scattered in chaotic disarray. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. His senses were heightened, his grip tight on the gun strapped to his side. He didn't know when the next wave of zombies would appear. In this world, one could never be too careful. Turning a corner, Marcus froze. There in the distance, he could hear the unmistakable shuffle of feet, the soft scrape of rubber on tile. His heart raced as he inched closer to the source of the noise. It wasn't just one zombie, there were several. They were moving in his direction, seemingly oblivious to his presence. Marcus's breath hitched in his throat as he crouched low, his body pressed against the cool concrete wall. He could see them now, 6 or 7 figures, their faces distorted and grotesque, their eyes empty of all humanity. They were moving in a tight formation, their movements slow but deliberate, the ending or development. The journey for the survivors had been grueling, filled with harrowing trials and losses, but now they faced the ultimate test. For the protagonist, every decision seemed to carry the weight of the world. With each new challenge, they had to decide whether to continue believing in the possibility of a future or succumb to the growing despair around them. The world they once knew had fallen apart,